I will do that. And then I'll fill my hustle.
Remember, I'm unidentifiable.
And maybe some other things, but that is
Glad to see you.
take time with the dogs.
Good evening. Well, good evening and welcome. I'm Jim Fredericks, Director of the Idaho Department of Fish and Game and the current Chair of the Interagency Grizzly Bear Committee. The role of the Chair for our agency rotates back and forth between state and federal agencies. So I'm currently starting the second year of my two-year term. And as Chair, I'm very pleased to be able to welcome you to this very special evening. Having worked in fish and wildlife management now for over 30 years, I'm well aware that not all meetings are joyous occasions. Not everybody understands that. And when I tell people that I work for the Fish and Game Department, I frequently hear the comment, "Oh, that sounds so interesting. You must have the greatest job in the world." And I know that I'm not the only one in the room that has heard that. And the fact is that I usually agree with that. It's an unbelievably interesting job, and I wouldn't trade it for anything. But as we all know, it's not all sunshine and roses. Very little is easy about natural resource management. Personal values, agency and organizational mandates and missions, economic factors, a growing population, and the many different demands that we put on our limited resources mean that we're often at odds on matters of policy and perspective. And grizzly bear conservation is certainly no exception to that. And it won't be news to you to learn that IGBC members do not agree on everything. But there is a common understanding amongst all of us that successful grizzly bear management and recovery and conservation requires a shared responsibility with all parties and continued promotion and coordination of grizzly bear conservation across all recovery areas. So tonight, let's focus on the sunshine and roses. We're here to celebrate the successful conservation and restoration of grizzly bears throughout much of their historical range. Prior to European settlement, our scientists estimate that there were about 50,000 bears living across 18 western states. These populations declined from the late 1800s to the point that we had an estimated 700 to 800 bears in 1975 when grizzly bears in the lower 48 were listed as threatened under the Endangered Species Act. Since that time, we've seen nearly a threefold increase in both the number of bears and the occupancy of their historical habitat in the lower 48. The populations in the recovery zone centered around Yellowstone and Glacier National Parks have been stable and increasing, and every year we see bears in places that we haven't seen them in over 100 years. This is truly a great American conservation success story. Who here has seen a grizzly bear in the wild in the lower 48? Amazing. And I think if we'd asked that question 40 years ago, the answer would look much, much different. And that success is owed in part to something else that we're here to celebrate tonight, and that's the 40th anniversary of the Interagency Grizzly Bear Committee. The agreement that formed this committee was initially signed by the Assistant Secretaries of Agriculture and Interior, as well as the governors of Idaho, Wyoming, Montana, and Washington. That agreement was signed in 1983, the same year that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service published its first recovery plan for grizzly bears in the lower 48. The agreement has been modified over the years, but the foundational need in the original MOA hasn't, which as stated is, to achieve the recovery of grizzly bears, it's necessary that all federal and state agencies with responsibilities for this species coordinate their management and research actions to the greatest extent possible to ensure the best utilization of available resources and prevent duplicative efforts. The IGBC itself is not a governing body or a legal entity, yet it has proven to be a successful model for agencies working cooperatively and coordinating recovery efforts over multiple jurisdictions. Today, our mission is still the recovery, delisting, and ongoing conservation of grizzly bears. Can I ask the IGBC Executive Committee members to please stand up? And I'd also like to ask those members here from those supporting agencies of the IGBC that are here in support to please stand up as well. Thank you all for your work. I also want to take a moment to acknowledge David Diamond, our executive coordinator. David is the quintessential cat herder, and I know I speak for all of us on the executive committee and the subcommittees when I say how much I appreciate the work he does to keep us moving forward. As stated on the IGBC website, grizzly bear conservation is complex and only made possible through partnerships. No truer words have been spoken or written. So tonight, as we celebrate the anniversary of the IGBC and talk about how far we've come with the conservation of grizzly bears, it's as much an acknowledgement of the many partners, including landowners, tribes, counties, NGOs, and the many others that work with us in our regional subcommittees and ultimately are responsible for the IGBC success. If you're here tonight, you likely know that the IGBC is a collaborative group, and between the executive committee and the subcommittees, there are a lot of meetings. In fact, our annual meeting tomorrow, business meeting, starts tomorrow. So if you're interested in attending, either online or in person, you can go to igbconline.org for info on how to attend. But that's tomorrow. Tonight, we want to focus on how we got here. We're going to introduce you to some of the dedicated scientists and managers who've devoted their careers to this effort. Some of the folks that we'll hear from have been at it a long time, and I think you'll find the historical perspectives fascinating and also a very important reminder of just how far we've come. So David will be serving as our moderator tonight, and now I'd like to ask him to come to the stage, and then I'll turn the program over to him.
Thanks very much, Jim. Once again, I'm David Diamond. I'm the coordinator for the Interagency Grizzly Bear Committee. And we've got 4 sections for you, 4 parts for this program. We're going to start at the 30,000 foot with an overview from a key official. Hilary Cooley is the Grizzly Bear Recovery Coordinator of the United States Fish and Wildlife Service, and she'll tell us where we were 40 years ago and where we are today. Second, as Jim just mentioned, I can't wait to introduce you to a panel of scientists and managers from each of the occupied ecosystems across the region. These folks have dedicated their careers to public service, to science and public land management. And you will hear how they got here and what they have seen over the decades. Third, after meeting some of our human experts, you'll get a chance to meet some grizzly bears. Our partners from the Grizzly Bear Wolf Discovery Center are here to share with you what bear resistant really means. And finally tonight, each of our agencies is committed to outreach and education, and increasingly that means working with partners and working with residents and visitors, and you'll get to hear about ways to get information to make yourself bear aware, and also emerging efforts to work in our communities as well. So to start off, I'm going to invite Hilary Cooley to the stage, and we're a little awkward in this setup here because of we have one microphone, so here this seat. So that's now.
Okay.
And you can be wherever you want to be, Hilary.
I'm going to pull this back.
And get my... Welcome, Hilary. So Hilary, I do want to ask you about where we were 40 years ago, but I want to start with your career. So really, lions, wolves, and bears?
Really?
Yeah, I've had a great career so far. I feel honored to be able to work on all the species I've worked on. And I think I started out following my brother around in the woods, trapping turtles, looking for bogs. Got really interested. I had a couple teachers, one teacher in high school and then another in college, that taught field natural history classes that really piqued my interest. And I think if I had not narrowed into wildlife, I would have become a field natural history specialist. And you know, I had a great college experience. I went to school in Vermont, University of Vermont. It's an awesome school. But I still didn't have things figured out. You know, I left there, moved to Wyoming. Rick moved to Wyoming. Just tried to figure things out. And I was wandering around in Laramie and found a flyer they were looking for a summer tech position on a mountain lion project. And I applied, and they said, can you handle some hounds? And can you hike with the heavy pack? And I said, well, yeah, I could do that. And I got the job. And so I spent the summer, you know, tracking mountain lions, and that, you know, told me this is what I need to do. So I had to go back to school and beef up my transcripts. And then I started applying to grad schools. I was looking for a project on a mountain lion, looking for a master's project on a mountain lion project or another carnivore, and I found one at Washington State. And I ended up staying there 7 years, worked on lions, and it was awesome. And after I got through with school, my first job was with Idaho Department of Fish and Game. I was a wolf biologist, never worked on wolves before, but they gave me the chance, and I did that. And I remember the first day I moved to Boise, and we were moving into our new house, and a bunch of people from that regional office came and helped me move in. And that was cool. And my boss was there, and he's like, here's the keys to your truck, here's your traps, you know, we'll see you in 6 months. And I just spent the summer trapping wolves, radio collaring, and that was an unbelievable experience. And then a Fish and Wildlife Service job came up, working on wolves as a wolf coordinator in Idaho, and it was just a natural, well, why wouldn't I put in for that? It's a pay raise. So I got the job, and a few years later, I had the opportunity to work on polar bears in Anchorage for the Fish and Wildlife Service. You know, the same kind of thing. The job came up, and I'm like, you know, I don't know much about polar bears, but they're white. You know, they live way far away. But that sounds pretty cool. And I put in for the job. I didn't get it the first time, but I got it. Came up again a year later. And the job is basically the same thing I do today, managing the polar bear program for the Fish and Wildlife Service. And that was another experience. I'm totally honored to have the chance to see what I saw and to do what I did. But this job, you know, was always on my bucket list, and so it came up, and I wasn't quite ready to leave Alaska yet, but I knew I had to take it, and that's how I got here.
Thanks, Hilary. And you're the second person to hold this recovery coordinator position for grizzly bears.
Yeah. Chris Servine was the first, and is Chris here tonight? I don't know, but you know, without Chris, I don't think we would be where we are today with grizzly bears in terms of recovery. So he put us where we are today.
And let's get into that. So where are we today? So in 1983, you know, so I guess 75 was the listing, as Jim mentioned, and then 83 was when this group was created.
Yep.
What was the situation?
Well, situation was not very good. You know, everybody probably in here knows the story. As the West was settled, we did a good job of eradicating large carnivores, including grizzly bears. And we used all sorts of methods to eradicate them. But there were a few holdouts in Yellowstone, in the Northern Continental Divide. So we had some small populations remaining there. But we still, you know, even though numbers were really small, we had these teeny little pockets, we were still feeding bears garbage. I mean, in Glacier, in Yellowstone, that was a source of entertainment. And Yeah, but shortly after that, 1973, the Endangered Species Act was passed, and then grizzly bears were listed in 1975.
And so Jim mentioned those two events from 1983. That was the year that Michael Jackson Thriller was on the charts and Return of the Jedi was in the theaters. So the recovery plan was the first thing, and then this collaborative group.
Yeah, so actually it's interesting all about that time. So bears were listed in 1975, but that didn't solve the problem immediately. And there's a memo from 1982 from the first chair of IGBC, and he said, if some change doesn't happen now, chances that to reduce human-caused mortality of grizzly bears, chances that the Yellowstone population will persist are minimal, and said we need to do something now. And so that was 82. That was the first year we published our recovery plan, and that provided a framework for population recovery areas, numbers, habitat needs, and so we've got the plan and now we need to implement it, and that's where IGBC comes in. So that was was set up through a voluntary MOU, I think, David, right? And the goal of that was to coordinate management, recovery, science of grizzly bears across the range, and that's, like Jim said, that's what we're doing this week. We continue to meet a lot, and we're still doing the same thing.
And we'll hear from some of our experts, but in broad terms, what do you attribute the change in direction that has happened since '83?
Oh, it's definitely partnerships. Working together, coordination. I mean, we have federal, state, and tribal agencies all participating. We, make it a priority to get together twice a year and coordinate all of these actions.
Thanks. And I'm just curious, your experience with polar bears, is there an IGBC for polar bears, or how would you contrast the differing challenges of these two species?
Yeah, I mean, there's some similarities for sure. You're both species. Your partnerships are really important. Working in the communities are really important. Using science to inform management, super important. People are passionate. Differences though, polar bears are way over there, so far distant. Even in Anchorage, my office, when I was doing polar bears, we were 700 miles away from a polar bear. And, it's not even, it's so far from your daily routine. It's hard to connect. There's people that live with polar bears, but there's just a handful of small remote coastal villages, and that's about it. And so, yeah, I think that's a big difference. The threats are different for sure. Grizzly bears, it's human-caused mortality, habitat, but we know how to mitigate that, and we're doing a good job of it. We've got tools to do that. We've got electric fences. We know, there's certain things that we're doing, and we've seen polar bears or grizzly bears respond. I mean, we've got, especially in Yellowstone and in the NCDE, they've responded to what we've done. For polar bears, the threat is declining sea ice, and that is a challenge. That is, how do you wrap your arm around that as a Fish and Wildlife Service, manager? It's very different. Is there an IGBC structure, IGBC-like structure? Not, kind of not really. For grizzly bears, we've got states. We've got 4 states in the range. For polar bears, we got 5 countries in the range. And so that's the coordination. Actually, in 1973, the agreement on the conservation of polar bears was signed by the 5 countries that host polar bears. So US, Russia, Greenland, Canada, and Norway. And the purpose of that agreement is the same thing, basically, as IGBC, to coordinate management, conservation, and research. We've got a couple of bilateral agreements, one with Russia that's a little awkward right now, and then one with Canada, and tech teams too. So we do have some similar structures.
Anything else that you want to make sure folks think about here this evening as we bring up our ecosystem panel?
No, I think this evening is a really unique opportunity. Sometimes we get caught up in the here and now, and even I put my blinders on, and I get focused in on what's going on right now. And so it's good for me even to have tonight to say, oh yeah, we used to be way over there, and we've come a long, long, long way.
Thank you so much, Hilary. I'm going to ask our panelists to come to the stage and grab one of these seats. I think if I move this forward, the light won't be as much in your eye. So we've got 4 experts here. Mark Haraldson from Yellowstone, John Waller from the Northern Continental Divide, Wayne Kasworm from the Selkirk Cabinet Yaak, and we're also pleased to have Mary Erickson from here in Greater Yellowstone, who's offering a management and Forest Service perspective. And what I'm going to do is have a little bit of a conversation with each of you just to introduce you, and then we can open it for questions amongst yourselves, and we can broaden the conversation. But Mark, I'm going to start with you, and you can't see the pictures that are behind you. But in the top left, take me back. I think that says 1958 on that shot.
Yeah, that's my first encounter with a bear in Yellowstone. I was actually in the car, and I think my mom took the picture, and I think it was either marshmallows or Oreos were the enticement. So it was a classic, 1950s Yellowstone bear experience.
And so how did that light a spark? You said you wanted to get to the mountains, you knew.
Yeah, I grew up on a farm in southern Minnesota, a small farm. And I was one of those kids that I was always wanting to be in the mountains. So the first opportunity I had, my dad, myself, and another classmate, we made a trip out when I was a senior looking at various schools, and one of our stops was Missoula, and that's where I ended up for school. And my first year there, I saw a flyer tacked on a professor's door looking for work-study students for the summer job. And I knocked on the door, and it was Chuck Jonkel, who was just starting the Border Grizzly project back then. I think it was 1975 he started. I knocked on that door in 1976. And he asked me a couple questions. Basically, he was good after I said I was a farm kid. So I had a job for the summer. And it was special in that several of us from that first summer, myself, Dr. Rick Mace, who worked for 30 years for Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, Tim Thier, who also worked for Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, and another guy named Joe Perry, who ended up wheat farming over by Brady. But we all started together that first summer working for Chuck up in the Whitefish Range, northern Montana. We worked out of a little cabin called Ninko Cabin on Whale Creek, and it was, I don't know, it was magical. I don't know.
Yeah, and was that work the same kind of work when you got to Yellowstone as a seasonal and going out to?
Well, we were trying to catch bears. There weren't many bears around there, but we ended up catching a couple. So we were working on trapping. We were doing telemetry follow-up, site visits, trying to figure out what the bears were doing. And Chuck was one of those, I like to call him first-generation modern grizzly bear biologists. A lot of us are what I would think of as second generation. We have a direct lineage back to some of those early old timers. And Chuck was instrumental in some of the polar bear work, that international convention that Hilary mentioned. He worked hard on that because he worked on polar bears for a lot of years, and then came back down to Montana from the Canadian Arctic and got the job with Grizzly Bear. It was called the Border Grizzly Project.
So then how did you come down to be in the Yellowstone ecosystem?
Well, after that first summer, I was hooked on bears, and I didn't care where the job was. I would go where I could find a job on bears. So I worked for Chuck till I graduated from high school, so I was up in northwest Montana until '79. And I worked for a season in northern Minnesota at the Cushway Lab, and then I went from there down to Colorado Division of Wildlife, worked on a black bear study down there for 4 or 5 years. And then in 1984, I was back up in Montana talking to Chuck, and Chuck said, well, you should apply for Yellowstone. I see they have some jobs. So I applied in Yellowstone, and Dick Knight, the original study team leader, he hired me. And it was one of those dream jobs for me, because I remember thinking, you know, this guy's telling us, he's giving us a truck, he's paying for the gas, he's giving us horses, and he's telling us to go in the mountains and try and catch some bears. And that's what life was. And I thought, man, it doesn't get any better than this. And, you know, those were the days when, you know, we didn't have inReach, we didn't have radio contact, cell phones. So, you know, there were times when he'd turn us loose, and 20 days later we'd come back into town, and he didn't know where we were from one end to the other. And we'd hand him a couple capture forms and a couple frequencies, and he'd say, good job, and here's where you're going next time. So we did a lot of backcountry and horse work, and it was a magical time while you're young.
And you heard Hilary describe the sense of urgency that if we don't make a change, we could lose the Yellowstone bear. Were you aware of that, or were you just focused on the task at hand?
When I started in the Yellowstone, I wasn't into the politics, the science, you know, I was out catching bears. That was my job, and we got pretty good at it. And I was really proud of the fact that we didn't kill any bears, we didn't hurt any bears, we didn't get anybody killed or hurt. Most of the time, all the horses we went in with are what we came out with. A couple of times it was a few days later that we finally got all the horses back. But, you know, it was just not in my realm, not in my wheelhouse at that time. And, you know, it got to be the point where in the late 90s, when Dick was thinking about retiring, and he kind of tapped me to come into the office and start learning some of the stuff that they were doing, that I started getting into that other realm of the science and the analysis and the writing. And I think it was the early 2000s was the last year I spent significant time in the field. And I've been a supervisor and writing and analyzing ever since. And that's been fun too.
And Mark and his colleagues at the Interagency Grizzly Bear Study Team developed that protocol for occupied range that you saw running here at the beginning. So Mark, I want to ask you about those early captures though. You said you were concerned about the well-being of the bears, and you were part of some efforts to make sure that was the data was valuable and
yeah. You know, I was proud of the fact that we really worked to increase standards of care for bears, and we implemented ecosystem-wide training for all the bear biologists or bear handlers in Yellowstone, and that blew up, where now Hilary's crew runs that every year for all bear handlers in the lower 48, and I guess from Alaska and Canada. And it's pretty well attended. I think last year there were like 85 different bear handlers attending the workshop. But we kind of started down here, and you know, I've often told people that, you know, you see car accident patients on the side of the road that aren't getting as good care as what we do for bears nowadays when we're handling bears. You know, oxygen, fluids, you know, the whole 9 yards, constant monitoring. But for me, it was one of the things whenever I drugged a bear, I was always really anxious and concerned until that bear got up and walked away. Then I felt like, okay, things are good, I'm happy. But I was always anxious when I was handling bears till they were up and on their own themselves. And one thing I did want to mention is this picture here. You know, one of the things that I was really fortunate and really proud of is that the partnerships and the colleagues that I had over the years, you know, some of them we've worked together for 30, 35 years almost, and developed a lot of trust. And I think us field guys, it was really special, the camaraderie we had in the field. And I've seen that same camaraderie and partnerships in the analysis and the products that we've done since I've come out of the field. So myself, I feel really lucky and blessed at the opportunities I've had. And I love working on bears.
And Mark, that's Kerry Gunter from Yellowstone and Kevin Fry from Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks in this photo, right?
Yep.
So I guess, you know, from when you were first going out and doing these captures and you know, focused on the daily task, to now looking back and putting this data set in perspective. And of course, you were able to capture hair samples that you now have been able to harness with the power of DNA. You know, what do does it make the work at the beginning and developing that data set, what does that mean to you as you look at the body of work here?
Well, a lot of things, but a couple of things. We were smart enough in the early days to take samples and keep samples. You know, even from the 80s, we've got samples that we've been able to throw at different molecular analysis like isotope work or genetics, and it's been a treasure. We have a treasure in the samples that we've maintained from this population for decades now, that we're throwing at new analysis with new PhD students. And having that longitudinal data set for all those years is allowing us to look at a lot of things that, you know, we didn't anticipate back then. But we had the foresight to, you know, hang on to some samples. The other thing that's amazed me is the analytical techniques that we can apply now, and the data that we're generating now with the, you know, GPS collars and you know, one of the first studies I did in the park was a recreation study where, you know, there's a couple guys in the audience that are shaking their heads now. But, you know, we were on the ground day and night with bears, taking hourly locations and activity data. Now you get all that with a GPS collar from your desk. But we were following the bears around at night, doing that hourly. If the bear moved, we had to move. And so we were hiking around Yellowstone at night with headlamps, singing little songs, you know. Because you want to make some sound because you're running into lots of and then, you know, after 24, 48 hours, we'd go in and intentionally disturb the bears and then monitor their reaction after a hiker disturbance. So, you know, that was one of the first studies I was a part of in Yellowstone. It was, yeah. And to hear my old boss talk, you know, that was one of the studies that some research steering committee on IGBC thought we should do.
Bringing it full circle. Well, thank you, Mark. Thanks for sharing those stories. again, and so we'll turn it now to John Waller. John is the wildlife biologist at Glacier National Park. And John, I'm going to ask you that same story of how you got into things, and this is a real who's who from the South Fork project. So.
Yeah, I guess I gotta start my remarks by saying, first off, I'm a lot younger than these guys. I showed up at U of M when Mark was already a legend trapping in Yellowstone. I think with Jamie too, right? Weren't you guys a team there? And so I was wandering around just kind of like, oh, I'd never be able to do anything as cool as that. I was a wildlife biology student. But I graduated U of M somehow and found myself unemployed in the Flathead Valley, volunteering on a river otter study in the Flathead River. It was a graduate project being conducted by my future wife. But, so she introduced me to some guys that work for Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, and they were sort of like Mark. They were like, we need somebody to trap bears, and I raised my hand. So they gave me a hatchet and some rope and hooked me up with these guys. And we started the South Fork Grizzly Bear Project, which was a 10-year research study looking at grizzly bear habitat use in the South Fork and the Flathead River drainage. And it was really, at the time, it was a really well-funded, kind of no-holds-barred research study to look at what made this grizzly bear population tick. And at that time, it was very difficult to trap grizzly bears. There just weren't that many around, so it took a huge effort. So this team of folks here, we lived in a remote workstation in the study area that actually collapsed in the winter '96, but it was kind of sketchy. But I was really fortunate to have been able to take part in that. I worked seasonally for a couple of years, and they liked me. And so the project leader at that time, Rick Mays, sent me to graduate school at a college called Montana State, and I got a master's in fish and wildlife management. And the assistant project leader at that time was Tim Manley, who went on to be a grizzly bear conflict specialist, one of the first in the States. And he was an amazing person. He just retired last year, but he started a lot of the work on the impacts of road density on grizzly bears. Tim and Wayne working together, I think published one of the first papers on road density. And so we sort of pursued that, and I think made some pretty significant contributions in understanding how security and road density impact grizzly bear survival and habitat use. But it was an amazing job. It kind of scars you for life. You get this project PTSD where it was so great and so awesome that you can never really match that. When the project ended, I went to work for Chris Servine, the grizzly bear recovery coordinator at that time. For Chris, I was more the GIS guy. I did a lot of computer stuff, but then he got money to do a study on how transportation affects grizzly bear movement patterns. And he said, John, you want to do that for a PhD? And I looked at him, I said, okay. And that was pretty amazing too. That was when GPS collars were first coming out, and I think it was the first grizzly bear study to deploy GPS collars as part of the study design. But that was an amazing experience. Trapped a lot of bears along the US Highway 2 corridor between Glacier Park and the Bob Marshall Wilderness Complex, and we tracked bears moving back and forth across the highway, monitoring highway traffic volume, monitoring train traffic volume, and so we looked at all of that and how that influenced grizzly bear movement patterns. And while I was in the process of finishing up my PhD, sort of like Hilary, this job came open at Glacier Park that I didn't really think I would necessarily get, but it would be the bear biologist for Glacier Park. And I ended up getting that job, and that was 21 years ago. So I've been the carnivore program manager at Glacier for 21 years now, which has been amazing in its own way, working with not just grizzly bears, but wolverine and Canada lynx and wolves. And yeah.
So John, you get to Glacier in 2002, and by then already quite a bit had been changed in the way that the park was managing visitation and interacting with its bears.
Yeah, so Glacier Park kind of mirrors the history of bear management across the nation. In Glacier, food storage was very lax. We let people feed bears, and then that all changed in August of 1967, a day we celebrate today, the Night of the Grizzlies. It's a perennial campfire classic. If you've never read the book, you should read it while camping. But basically, 2 women were killed in different parts of Glacier National Park on the same night. And that was a watershed moment for the Park Service, service-wide, because it's like, oh my gosh, how could this happen? And so it caused huge changes in how we manage human waste, garbage, that kind of thing, grizzly bear management. But it was an evolution. Starting in 1967, the Park Service developed bear management plans, and then over the years, bear management techniques evolved to get better and better. So by the time I showed up in Glacier in 2002, there'd already been quite a bit of work on how to minimize bear-human conflicts. And Tim Manley actually did a lot of the work in Glacier Park, showing the Park Service how to train bears to avoid people, basically teaching bears boundaries. So Tim Manley and Kerry Hunt spent quite a few summers tooling around the park, showing Park Service personnel how to manage bears in a more enlightened way. And so when I showed up, a lot of that groundwork had already been done, but I was able to carry that forward. And when I started working there, so at the end of the 1990s, Glacier National Park had a reputation as the place where people went to get eaten by bears. We had a couple maulings a year, a couple grizzly bears killed a year for management purposes. But since I've been there, and I tell my boss this every year during my performance evaluation, our human injury rate has just declined almost to zero. The number of bears we remove for management purposes has declined almost to zero. All the while, our human visitation has shot through the roof. When I started working there, it was 1.5 million visitors a year, and it's 3 million now. So I do worry that grizzly bears are going to lose credibility if they don't start. No, it is an amazing thing, and it shows you what's possible. I mean, we have a lot of tools and regulations at our disposal to guide human behavior. You throw a burrito out your car window in Glacier National Park, you're going to get pulled over and you'll get a ticket. And you take it very seriously. You go outside the park boundary and nobody's going to care, right? So in a way, I live in la-la land, bear management la-la land, because we have a really good control of how people have to behave. And outside the park, we don't have that control. But it does show what's possible and how bears can respond to that, and so how good things can be.
Great, thanks, John. We'll come back to the audience. So next up, we have Wayne Kasworm from Fish and Wildlife Service. Wayne is based in Libby, Montana now, and Wayne, I think you were in that photo that John showed, the South Fork.
Yeah.
So how did you get into that shot?
Well, I was happened to be available at the time to assist with some trapping, and so I spent a summer assisting on that, and that was in 1989, I believe, was the summer that I spent assisting that.
But prior to that, I guess it was 83 that you got to Libby, is that right?
So that's correct. I was working on the East Front with Keith Awney, capturing collaring bears on the East Front, Choteau, Augusta vicinity. And I'd previously done my graduate work there on mule deer, and it set me up for an opportunity to work for Keith. Similar situation, see a job posted, and it's bears were not necessarily an important issue for me. I was more of a deer guy, and but the job came open, and I thought, well, here's an opportunity. I still get to fly around, check on animals, ride a horse, see if I can catch some bears. And so that's what I was doing prior to 1983, did that for 2 summers. And in '83, a job came open that Fish, Wildlife, and Parks was advertising. And by the way, I was working for Fish, Wildlife, and Parks at the time doing that. But a job came open in the Cabinet Mountains, and I applied for it, and it was a year-to-year thing that was actually funded by a mining company. A company that wanted to mine silver and copper in the Cabinet Mountains. And so the funding was a little bit year to year, but I took the job and it turned into a career.
So can you set the geography for us? The cabinets are quite different than Yellowstone or Glacier, and it wasn't so easy to find bears when you got there.
And that's true. And you know, people ask me, well, why would a mining company want to fund something like that? Well, the actual answer was that the mining company knew that if they wanted to develop this deposit, this find that they had there, that they were going to have to do an environmental impact statement. They were going to need some data on bears. And so the study started off as quite a bit of black bear work, and we collared a bunch of black bears. And I think there might be a picture up there of a black bear, and we went to black bear dens and pulled out cubs and did a lot of things interesting with black bears as well. But you know, that was the situation, and the cabinet's cedar hemlock forest, deep dark forest, not at all like well, like the East Front or like some of the other places where I'd worked before. Rains a lot in the cabinets as well. And I spent a lot of days wandering around in knee-high boots through the mud, getting into places where we could set traps for bears.
And 678.
And so, yeah, maybe not the best picture, but it's a pretty old picture. So I was fortunate enough that when I got there, I was working with another person, familiar, I think, to some folks here in the audience, Mike Madel, who became actually we switched jobs about a year later. He was in the cabinets, I came to the cabinets, and I left the East Front, and Mike went back to the East Front thereafter and became a conflict manager on the East Front. But the first bear that we caught is the bear that's pictured up here. And we knew it was an old bear to start with. The way that you age bears is you look at teeth wear. And this bear did not have a lot of teeth. But you also look at extracting a tooth. And probably many of you are aware, but you can age a bear by counting the cementum layers. Under a microscope, you can section a tooth and you can count rings in a bear's tooth much the same way you can count rings in a tree. Turned out this bear was 28 years old at the time of capture. She wore a radio collar for another 6 years until 1989. Caught her a couple times along the way there. She never had cubs during any of the time that we either captured her or seeing her out of the airplane. But we lost track of her in '89 until 1993, when a hunter found some bones and the claws of a grizzly bear in the Cabinet Mountains. And there was still some tissue attached to these claws. So that bear had not been dead very long. So those went into the archive, and Mark said that we're all a bunch of pack rats and that we save all kinds of crap. And so we saved that, and at a later point in time, we were able to identify those claws as being this particular bear. So I think she would have been dead at the age of approximately either 37 or 38, and to my knowledge still is a record book bear for longevity in the wild.
So from 83 to 89, how many others were you, what were you finding in terms of the situation?
Not very many bears, that's for sure. I remember my graduate advisor here at Montana State University, we ended up catching 3 bears. And he always asked me, how in the hell did you run a career on 3 bears? So anyway, we made the most of it. But at the end of the study, we essentially came to the realization that bears in the cabinets are not doing well. So we made a proposal to actually augment that population, and to make a long story short, since 1980, since 1990. Well, let me back up just a little bit. Believe it or not everybody thought this was a really good idea. And so we worked with our local citizens group, and we finally got the okay to do a test with 4 bears that we got from British Columbia, put them in the cabinets. We monitored those 4 bears, and one of those bears we later detected with DNA, and we detected some offspring from her. And we took that back to our citizens committee and said, hey, this can work. And so we got the go-ahead to continue. And in we started in 1990, moved 4 bears. And then by 2002, we had that information. And we began the program again with Fish, Wildlife, and Parks doing the capture work. And since that time, we've moved 22 total bears into the Cabinet Mountains, and taken a population that was probably in the neighborhood of single digits when we started the program. And we're now up to a population of approximately 30 to 35 bears.
Thanks, Wayne. And I guess putting that also in comparison with the Selkirk and your larger range that you work with now.
And so I had the opportunity to continue some of the work. There was an individual who was working in the Selkirks at the same time that I was working in the cabinets, and the Yak as well. Wayne Walkenen was a biologist for Idaho Fish and Game, and in about 2011 or 2010, he ended up taking another job within the Idaho department. He basically went up and became a regional wildlife manager. And at that point, he contacted me and asked us if we'd be willing to take over some of the monitoring in the Selkirks. And so since that time, we've been capturing bears in the Selkirks and doing some of that work over there, continuing that effort. And I think we're also looking at a resounding recovery in the Selkirks as well. And a population that it may even be, if you count the Canadian side, might be approaching even 100 bears today. We're going to do an analysis to see where we are. But you mentioned some of the techniques. The DNA has really been an interesting opportunity. We do a lot of hair snagging. We have rub trees that we check. We get a lot of hair that way and analyze that hair, and we get a lot of really interesting information about maternity and paternity. And that's how we know today how the Cabinet Mountains augmentation has been going. We actually monitor that population almost exclusively with DNA. I mentioned taking that population up to 30 to 35 bears. We have one individual in that population that has produced cubs on, I think we're probably up that she's produced at least a dozen first-generation offspring. And we're now out to the 3rd generation arising from that single individual that we put in about 1992.
Thanks, Wayne. But to shift gears, and again, the model here is science informing management, and our ecosystem subcommittees each have science teams, and they also have managers. And so I want to introduce Mary Erickson, who is the forest supervisor here on the Custer Gallatin. Mary, on the left there, I think that's one of your first. Is that one of your first assignments with the Forest Service, or how did you get into forestry and land management?
Let's see. So sitting here on this panel, you feel a little bit like an interloper, as I'm not a wildlife biologist, not a bear biologist. I grew up in the Midwest. Actually moved my family moved all around. My father was a World War II vet and then became a doctor and then became a psychiatrist, and so we never stayed anywhere very long. Didn't have a lot of association with camping or the outdoors. My father couldn't probably check the oil in his car, but he could read books, and he was kind of an intellectual. But when I was 18 years old, I wanted to move out west. I ended up out in Oregon and started in forestry school at Oregon State. I don't know if I really knew what forestry was about, but I knew I wanted to be out west and I wanted to do something different. I didn't want to go to Georgetown or Notre Dame, which would have been my father's choices. So anyway, ended up in Oregon. I loved it out there, started in forestry school and worked for Oregon Department of Forestry for a while and ended up kind of falling into a job with the Forest Service. My very first job, I think I'm as long tenured as IGBC.
40
so,
years.
40 years. Yeah. So, but I started with the Forest Service as just out of grad school on a co-op appointment, and I started on a forest plan revision team. So it was a little bit different place to start in the Forest Service, but for me what I loved is that instead of necessarily starting at the ground level and doing work, you were actually on that interface with the public around land management choices and policy and what did people care about. And all these years later I think about that because I think about starting on a planning team and holding public meetings on a national forest in Southern Oregon. And you would hold a public meeting and hardly anyone would show up. Maybe there would be 5 or 10 people and you were excited if you got that many people. And then you take it to our world now and people are really, they're excited, they're engaged. It's not hard to get people to show up. So I started my career in Oregon, started on a forest plan revision team, and then I ended up getting a job as a district ranger in a small town called Chemult. It's kind of a wide spot in the road, south of Bend, Oregon. It was a ranger district that didn't actually have a lot of, it didn't have bears, it didn't have a lot of other wildlife issues, but it was a starting point for young people out of school that were coming out of the Peace Corps or just starting their work, and just a great place to start with the Forest Service. A lot of good energy, a lot of people who like to work together, in that sense of, that sense that you have in any workplace of when folks like to be there, you have a sense of common purpose. I lived on a government compound, which still exists in the Forest Service, where everyone had parties in the evenings, and people met their future spouses, and you got to know them before they had kids, and you watched people grow up together. So it was a great place to start my career with the Forest Service. I was a district ranger there for 11 years, and then I ended up moving to central Utah, where I was a forest supervisor on the Fish Lake National Forest. Beautiful high country in rural Utah, and I enjoyed the work there very much. I really enjoyed the communities, but after my time in Oregon and my time in Utah, I was really looking to be someplace in the Forest Service that had bigger landscapes, big country. The allure of Montana was something I had never lived here before, but I was really drawn to. And I applied for the job on the Gallatin Forest as the forest supervisor, and ended up here. And it's kind of been the honor of my lifetime and career. When I first called and had accepted the job and I got to meet people in the forest, they were all wearing Groucho noses and glasses. I knew I'd come to the right place.
So very much like John, when you got to Custer Gallatin in 2007, a lot had already changed for the forests in the greater Yellowstone. What was your sense and what was your introduction to the work that had come before and what you were stepping into?
Well, I'll tell a couple stories on that. I want to reflect on early on in my time here in the forest. I'll come back around to the structure that's in place in this ecosystem. But early on in my time here, I had the opportunity to go into the Absaroka Beartooth Wilderness with Mr. Dan Tyers and Ken Britton, who is the district ranger, and a couple folks from the Park Service, and really see through people's eyes who have been working in this ecosystem for a long time, the value of that place. We got to stay, we rode in on horseback, talked about challenges in the ecosystem, and stayed in one of the backcountry cabins. They let me have the higher bunk so that people were sleeping on the floor, and you woke up in the early morning and saw the light coming in and the mice running across the people who were sleeping on the floor, and you thought, this is really the life. So, I don't know if that equates to how the biologists feel, but it was just thinking, there's something special about this place. One of the things I would say that feels unique to me, so I've been with the Forest Service for 40 years, and on the Forest Service side, we have what's called line officer positions, meaning positions where you're a district ranger or a deputy forest supervisor or a forest supervisor, where your role is principally decision making, but you're not necessarily a specialist in any particular discipline, which means you really rely on the folks that you work with and people who have the knowledge and expertise. And one of the things that felt very different coming to this ecosystem, and I don't know if it's what it feels like on the NCDE, but there is so much history, there's so much interagency cooperation, there's so many structures in place to really offer support and context and just a sense of what's happening in the ecosystem for people that I didn't see in other places in the National Forest system. You might come to a National Forest, and of course you have your support system on that unit, but here that interagency operating environment it's impressive. And the researchers and the scientists and the bear biologists and the people who have worked together for decades. And now I do remember coming to one of the first, it was called IGBC meetings there in the Yellowstone Ecosystem Subcommittee, and going to one of the first grizzly bear meetings, and there were the public in the audience, and there was this huge table with seemed like 50 managers all sitting there with their placards in front of them. And I thought, I think I went through 2 or 3 meetings where you really didn't have to say anything. You just had to kind of look like you were listening and think deeply. And I remember thinking, what is it this group does? But what Mark Harrelson informed me of, because he gave me a ride one time, is he told me really the bear biologists are doing all the work and the study team is doing the work, and really it's the managers can be helpful at times in setting context and making decisions. As long as you fully appreciate the bear biologists. But there was a lot of wisdom to that. But anyway, my point being, in this ecosystem, it's certainly not perfect, but there is more support and reliance on each other. That dynamic, it's so impressive, the dynamic with the bear biologists with Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, and the folks you work with and you meet out in the field, and how much they know and how wise they are and how interconnected they are with a district biologist on a ranger district, and with the Fish and Wildlife Service biologists. And again, there's something special about that.
That's wonderful. And so to call it back, so you said at the beginning of your career you had not much public attending meetings. So in these pictures here, it's showing this philosophy of caring for the land and serving people, and being in contact. Why does this work require so many meetings? And how do you feel about the connections that you make through this work?
Well, probably for all of us, it's not as if we love meetings, but there is something about needing to be out there and connecting and hearing from people. The bottom slide is actually a bison meeting where we were talking about the long-term potential for bison in the Taylor Fork and what that expansion might mean and how people felt about that. But the nature of all of our work, I think, in public land management, really regardless of what role you have, is you have to be out there and you have to be accessible to people. And in natural resource management, there's plenty for people to disagree about. But until you put yourself out there and really are available to people, you can't make informed decisions. I would also kind of reflect back, because I'm seeing Jody and thinking about, there was a 2-year period where I was the chair of the Grizzly Bear subcommittee. And it was an exciting and interesting time, and in that period of time, we were anticipating delisting, the second delisting of the Yellowstone grizzly bear, and we were really working hard on the conservation, updating the conservation strategy. And I think obviously everyone in this room knows this, but I don't think the general public really understands that there's been this huge investment in the success of grizzly bear recovery. And if and when bears are ever delisted, that investment and commitment by all the agencies and partners doesn't go away. And a big piece of that then is that you have a conservation strategy that really is it binds you to long-term commitments for how you would manage habitat and how you would address modeling and all the other aspects of that. So the time when I was working on the can't remember if it was YGCC or yes, but as the chair of the Grizzly Bear subcommittee, we ended up with a lot of meetings, and a lot of those meetings were really maybe painful on the public side, but for us as managers and biologists were really to hash out those intricate details of what will these commitments mean, and every word in those commitments. Again, you could drive people crazy in the audience, but every word of those commitments is something that the agencies and the entities really need to understand, and they need to understand what those choices are and what you're going to commit to, because that's your obligation to the public moving forward. So it's just hard, painful work, and some of that you have to do in a transparent way, and you have to, well, probably most of it you have to do in a transparent way so people can see the sausage being made, but they can also, whether they agree or disagree with the outcome, can feel like they understand what you're doing.
Thanks. So you mentioned investment, and just one more question for you briefly, if you could mention the partnership that the forests of the Greater Yellowstone have had with the Greater Yellowstone Coalition in terms of getting infrastructure out on the landscape.
Yeah, that's a great one. I obviously very, very impressed with and appreciative for the work of the Greater Yellowstone Coalition, the partnership that David mentions. And again, I feel like Dan Tyler should be telling this story, but I'll start with, we had a fatality in the Soda Butte campground back in 2010. A lot to that backstory, because the stories are always really human stories, right? And they're pretty tragic human stories. A gentleman from Grand Rapids, Michigan, who's out on his motorcycle on a vacation that his wife paid for so that he could take the trip of a lifetime, and he's camping in a Forest Service campground and the Soda Butte campground just outside of Cook City, and of course he's killed that evening. And I know that Dan was there, and the bear biologists were on scene, and with the coroner and others responding to that. And I remember driving over to the campground, and Kevin Fry standing there, and Dan and Jeremiah, and I can't think of who else. And of course, it's a pretty sober scene, and you're thinking about the board of review and what do you make out of this, and the man who was killed was doing everything right. I mean, he had a clean camp. You look at it and you can say he was doing what we would have asked a responsible citizen to do, and yet he had been killed. So you're trying to figure out what to learn from it. And I remember the bear biologist standing there, again, pretty sober, and for whatever reason, I don't know who started the conversation, but I think I said something like to them about, would you camp in this campground? And they started looking at each other and said, no. and they all seemed to agree, no, I wouldn't camp in this campground. And then pretty soon I started saying, well, what about this campground? So I started naming campgrounds on the forest, and they'd say, no, I wouldn't camp in a tent in that campground either. And we started listing that. And for me, it was one of those moments where you go, so it's interesting. The bear biologists are telling us something here, and out of that, there was a lot of evolution of that dialogue, but starting with our work with Dan on that national forest to say, what do we learn from this? Like, where do you go with this? And that evolved into a conversation across all the national forests in the GYA around what could we learn from this, and Dan had a team of people starting to inventory the situation in campgrounds across the GYA. And we started this as a smaller, kind of tight group of campgrounds. And I remember at one point Dan had developed the list of the top 20 campgrounds, which really made managers nervous. The top 20 high-risk campgrounds. And really from that outcome and that dialogue, then it turned into a full inventory of, I don't know how many, 400 and some large number, 164 campgrounds in the Greater Yellowstone that were National Forest System campgrounds, because the Forest Service, obviously you're inviting people to the forest, you have developed sites. We don't have the same level of management of sites that the Park Service has. We don't have the same level of resources, we don't have that same level of education and interface with the public in all of our campgrounds. So we've done this full inventory of campgrounds, and in that dialogue, it started a dialogue with Greater Yellowstone Coalition about infrastructure needs in campgrounds. And again, I give tremendous credit to Dan and to GYC and Chris Colligan and others who said, hey, this is a partnership that we could support for a service if you're invested in it. And they, for a number of years, basically put up to the tune of millions of dollars, kind of matching money for the Forest Service to put food storage and put infrastructure in all those campgrounds in the Greater Yellowstone, and really beyond the recovery zone or the primary conservation area, and expanding out to multiple campgrounds well outside that. We're actually in, I don't know, Dan, if we're calling it phase 2 or phase 3, but we're really into the next phase of actually expanding that out to all the campgrounds on all those units. And yeah, huge partnership. GYC has been a tremendous player, and there's a lot of great groups, a lot of great NGOs, but I have to admit, I have a soft spot for folks who are really willing to work with their members and really do something, put some skin in the game, and do something that is really, that they partner with agencies and really is productive and makes a difference. And GYC is also working with us on that in the Greater Yellowstone on the next round of partnerships around road decommissioning.
Thanks so much, Mary. So it's going to be a little awkward with just the one microphone, but I just wanted to see if, as the others on the panel were talking, if any of you had a thought that popped into your head, or have a question for each other, or an additional story you want to share. It looks like, John, you've got the mic. Do you? And it's okay if we... Yep, Mark.
It's been mentioned a couple of times about when IGBC started, and one of the things that we saw early on, initial publications that the study put out, Dick Knight and Lee Eberhardt as lead authors on it, they saw a negative trajectory for the population in the late 70s, early 80s. And the food storage orders were a big part of changing that trajectory. The IGBC was critical in getting the message out that we need to stop killing females if we want this Yellowstone population to survive and grow. And the food storage orders and efforts to reduce female mortality were a big part of that. And in my career, when I was primarily in the field from 84 through early 2000s, we monitored a lot of bears that were part of that wildlife monograph that we published in 2006 that showed that from the mid 80s to early 2000s, we had really robust population growth in this Yellowstone population. And a large part of that was, changing the trend, changing the mortality. in this ecosystem. That was one thing I wanted to mention.
Anyone else have some additional thoughts or questions for each other?
Well, one thing I would mention, a little story. The bear that I showed that was the old bear, I said that we only caught 3 bears. Interestingly enough, those 3 bears were all related, and possibly some of the last bears in the Cabinet Mountains. One bear was 27. That bear that you saw the picture of was 28. We caught another bear that was 11 at the time, but that represented mom, dad, and a son. A little story about the son. He unfortunately, during the fall after we captured him and put a radio collar on him, he encountered a hunter who mistook him for a black bear and ended up shooting him twice with a .30 caliber rifle at fairly close range. But the bear actually survived, denned, and came out the following year, and we were able to capture that bear. And we dug a bullet out of that bear, which I still have today, that I keep in my office. And he was doing just fine. Kind of interesting, a little tidbit about some of the other bears in the cabinets. But it's kind of a tough life in there as well, and that's why through mortality reduction and through the augmentation program that we've able to bring some bears back in the cabinets, and we are continuing that program as well. Because we're not out of the woods yet, and certainly there are issues with a small population and genetics, and so we will continue to move bears in there, at least until a point in time where we can see some natural immigration and movement from other populations, which is really important for the Cabinet Mountains, for the Cabinet Yak, and for the Selkirks. Those are small populations that probably are going to have a recovery goal of maybe in the neighborhood of 100 bears. But 100 bears without any connection, without any genetic interchange, is probably not going to persist in the long run. So connectivity is a really important issue, particularly for those populations, not to mention many of the others that we have here as well.
Thanks, Wayne. Anyone else have a closing thought? John, anything from NCD, or actually Mary's got a thought?
Well, actually, not so much a thought. I'm curious when we, and this could go to any of you, but I thinking about the future of managing conflicts with bears and bear expansion and connectivity. One of the challenges I know I have, I'm getting reflective after my 40 years with the Forest Service, but I think about so many times when the public thinks about a natural resource agency's role, people tend to want you to regulate. They really want approaches to why don't you can regulate this, you can require everyone to carry bear spray, you can eliminate livestock grazing allotments, you can eliminate, so much of the response that we hear often is to promote expansion of bears. You need to eliminate uses, you need to prohibit things, or you need to take a regulatory approach. And yet it feels like the future for bears between ecosystems is really around communities and in private lands. And so those approaches have to be different. So what do we need to be working on that's really beyond the public lands piece? What's the answer for the next success in bear conservation?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because the future, I think, for bears is really bright, because one of the things I've seen, and I'm sure you've seen it too, is a change in human tolerance for bears. People are way more accepting of bears than what they were 20, 30, 40 years ago. And that's a really good thing. And the big lesson is you just can't let bears get into your food or garbage. 90% of bear conflicts are related to that. And it seems like such an easy thing to ask. What do we want to do? Don't let bears get into food or garbage. There it is. conflicts, 90% of bear conflicts. But for some reason, it's really hard for people to adopt that. I don't know why, but it's getting better. There's lots of people working to get that message out. People are willing to take it on. So I think the future for bear conservation is really bright. I was at the 20th anniversary of the IGBC at the Blackfoot Clearwater Game Range. And at that time, I didn't contemplate attending the 40th anniversary of the IGBC. But it's been a great model. The IGBC has been really important in this work, and it's been thrown out as being a model for conservation of other species. And I think it probably will be adopted at some point for that, just because it is a great interagency structure.
Thanks, John. And you got one more thing?
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead, Mark.
Um,
And this will be the last word.
Well, my
No
mentor,
pressure.
my mentor Chuck Jonkel, you know, his mantra back in the 70s was habitat, habitat, habitat. You know, don't worry about the numbers, habitat. And I think of where we've seen bears show up this last decade. You know, we had a Yellowstone bear in the Snowy Mountains. We had a bear in the Pryors. We had a bear in the Southern Bighorns. We've had bears in the Missouri Breaks. We've had bears in the Rocky Boys, the Belts. You know, that's just the stuff on the east side. Chuck would be amazed at where bears have shown up this last decade, and he'd be pretty tickled with it. And I think we should all be tickled with, you know, the recovery that they've made, that we've allowed them to make.
Thanks so much, Mark. And let's have a hand for this panel. Thanks so much. And John gave us a terrific segue because our next discussion here is with John and Randy. If you could both come up and so let me just, here's the mic. Okay, you go have a seat. So IGBC began providing guidance and direction relative to bear-resistant containers in the 1980s with a goal of ensuring effective storage and attractants and minimizing human grizzly bear conflicts. This testing program is a partnership with the Grizzly and Wolf Discovery Center, the Wildlife Management Institute, and we've recently added the Washington State University Bear Center in Pullman. Products must meet specific criteria in order to be certified as bear resistant by the IGBC. And you can check to see if a product you are thinking of purchasing or that you already own is one of the nearly 500 products from more than 100 manufacturers that are on our IGBC list on our website. I want to recognize Scott Jackson. Scott Jackson with the Forest Service National Carnivore Lead is also the project manager for the Bear Resistant Container Program. And I really want to recognize this evening John Heine and Randy Gravatt from the Grizzly Bear Wolf Discovery Center. John, do you want to give us an opener here? And then we'll turn it over to Randy and the Bears.
Sure. Just real quick, I'll tell you a little history about the center. Some of you may know about it. It was a very unpopular idea put together by a developer who wanted to have a bear, what he called sanctuary, in West Yellowstone, right on the border of Yellowstone National Park. It didn't work out great for him. He sold it to a large corporation. That corporation didn't make enough money. They were going to close it or sell it. And just to tell you about the employees there, they were so dedicated to making it into something that was worthwhile that they put together a nonprofit. They put their houses up as collateral and purchased it for $1.7 million and made it into a nonprofit. So nobody owns it, it's a nonprofit. And we've just been adding more educational venues over time, talking more about the Yellowstone ecosystem, how everything's interrelated. And of course, we do take in bears that have to be removed from the population I guess we could almost call it the Tim Manley Discovery Center right now, so because we have 4 of his bears there. But we try to be really educational. We show people what to do and what not to do when they're in bear country. We enrich the habitat. We set up situations so the bears are getting into bird feeders or containers or garbage cans, just so they see that their actions have repercussions. And all those bears that are there, they have their story, and it's usually people related. So we're, as I say, nonprofit. We're accredited by the Association of Zoos and Aquariums, which means we meet the highest standards for animal welfare, and we're actually trying to give back more and more as we can. The board just put together our first ever Kirk Horn Memorial Inventors Challenge. So it's, if you can come up with some kind of bear resistant, whether it's a container, a latch, some kind of electrical thing, there's a $10,000 prize. Go to our website, you'll see how to maybe try to win that prize. But we're trying to do all the right things, and we're really honored to be here tonight. So appreciate you having us.
Thank you, John. We really appreciate the partnership. So Randy, I'm going to pull up your video, and Randy is the testing coordinator.
So I put some videos, just some quick videos. Everything that gets tested has to be filmed so we can document the 60 minutes of time. With a backpack canister in particular, a 1/4-inch hole or larger is a fail for these canisters. Where that bear is tossing it right now, yeah, it did land on a rock at the moment, but quite often they do toss them up in the air purposely to what we think anyways, to break them open, whether it be rock or concrete. That would be the CPR method. Pretty successful. We've seen, or more so, the bears have seen pretty much everything. We put the bear's favorite food inside: fish, peanut butter, honey, dog kibble. Another backpack canister. I feel, because I've been a part of the testing since the beginning, it seems to me like when a bear first gets that product, if they can feel any kind of weakness in it, any kind of movement, they're going to try that much more. It's almost as if they take a bite into it, they push on it, that it gives them a pretty good idea whether they're going to get in or not. Again, 60 minutes of active time that they have to work on that product. $40 to $60 products a year, with about a 50%, maybe 45% pass-fail rate. When we first started testing 20-some years ago, pretty much only about 10% of the products passed. So manufacturers didn't really understand how strong, how smart, and how food-driven the bears are. Coolers are the #1 product tested. Everybody, it seems like, wants to make a bear-resistant cooler out there. Coolers are the same, pass or fail. Has to be a 1/4-inch hole or larger. So that means they have to tear through the outer layer, the styrofoam, then through that inner layer, unless they're able to separate the lid from the body. All coolers that are tested either need a padlocks, or a bolt and a nut method. There is a new product out there that's pretty neat called a bear bolt. It makes it a lot easier, something you don't have to carry. This particular product was very interesting when we got it. It is, yes, completely made of styrofoam. They obviously didn't watch any videos of bears testing coolers, thinking that was going to pass. Not too much wind on that day, but quite a problem when it's very windy and the bears are tearing that styrofoam. It tends to get a little bit of everywhere. But yeah, someone literally thought that completely made styrofoam cooler was going to pass the test. There is some bears that are better testers than others. There is a process I do when we get some cubs there. It's training. Whether it's a cooler that has 2 padlocks, maybe only put zip ties instead of the padlocks. Give them that food reward. Let them get in. Let them know. Let them learn that there's a lot of goodies inside there. Then move on to 1 padlock on a corner, zip locks on the other side, or zip ties on the other side, and then eventually the 2 padlocks. Really gives the visitors that come to the Grizzly Center a pretty strong example when they thought the bungee cords over top of a cooler were going to keep a bear out. Most people are very, very surprised how strong, how food-driven they are. We test from April 1st to October 1st. A lot of it has to do with the temperatures. So a little bit halfway through this product, but as you can see, what we call quite often a cleanup on aisle 4. Again, once they get a hole started, seems like they almost always get that hole started with their teeth, working their claws, maybe tearing the plastic apart. Other than that blue styrofoam cooler that was on this video before this one, I think the record for a bear getting in was 6 minutes. So pretty darn quick.
So Randy, when they're getting towards that hour, do you see some frustration, or what happens when the product is standing up? How do the bears react to that?
For the most part, they're going to keep trying. For the visitors, they're all pretty much upset if the bear doesn't get in there. They ask the question, aren't you going to give them something? They put all that effort into it. And they do get the food reward when they go back into the building. But they have to try a little harder next time. Probably the neatest product that we've tested, it was some years ago, was a Kevlar backpack. A gentleman out of California made it, and it did take 2 or 3 tries. I should know the weight, but we're talking a half a pound or less, so completely made of Kevlar, a backpack. So here we have the CPR maneuver. This is Sam, our largest, or was our largest bear. Sadly, he's no longer with us. That is the Kodiak cart. That's the only product that ever passed the test with Sam. Most manufacturers never wanted Sam to test a product at 1,000 pounds, but that Kodiak cart passed the test, and purposely to be marketed in Alaska where the bears are that big. That bear is Nakina. We call it Nakina Rocks. She just, that was one of her favorite spots to hang out. So, thank you.
Thanks so much, Randy, and thanks so much, John, and to the bears at the center, and for all that we are able to learn together. Thank you for the partnership. So I'm going to ask Lori Roberts to come back up to the stage. And again, some of the questions that Mary Erickson and John Waller posed were very pertinent to the work that our agencies are taking on now. So Lori is a research assistant with Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. And, you need a microphone. And also works with our interagency group on information, education, and outreach. So similar to the other panels, Lori, I'm going to ask you your story. How did you get into bears and into this work?
So I started, my parents worked in Yellowstone National Park. So I started going to Yellowstone National Park when I was 12 years old. I grew up in the Midwest in Iowa, and every summer we would head out to Yellowstone where I got to play around and be a park rat. And so the picture over there on the right, I was probably 12 years old, and my parents thought, well, you need something to do. So I started volunteering, and I volunteered in the campgrounds, and I volunteered in the visitor center, and even the backcountry office. I was handing out backcountry permits as a 12-year-old to people, going, sure, you should go there. It's a great place. Never been there in my life. But actually, I started living in Yellowstone in '93, and it took me 2 years to see a bear in Yellowstone National Park. I mean, we lived in Grant Village, so we lived in the heart of Yellowstone, and we heard about bears and the rangers, going to bear jams and things like that, but it wasn't a very big occurrence, and it took me 2 years to see my first grizzly bear in Yellowstone. And then I went from there to, after I graduated high school, I started working in Mammoth Hot Springs for the Park Service, and worked for Rick McAdams in the backcountry office and campgrounds and the front gate, who was one of the gate girls. And then I went to school at University of Montana and decided to spend a summer not going back to Yellowstone until Carrie Gunther called me and said, hey, I have a job that we're looking for a student to help with a master's project in Yellowstone, and it's like the one person that could have called me that I couldn't turn down. And like all these other guys, a job came up, and I took it. So I worked in the bear management office for 5 years, and then flying in helicopters, catching bears, doing a lot of bear jams. It's where I learned one lesson was to not yell run at a bear jam. That really causes a lot of chaos. But then I started in 2005. I was kind of looking for a little something more and not working for the Park Service, finding my own way, and I took a job working for Mike Madel on the Rocky Mountain Front in 2005, and then 2007 I worked my way over to Region 1 and worked with Tim Manley and Eric Wenham doing conflict. And then in 2009, a job came open working for Rick Mace on the trend monitoring project. And so I took that, and that turned into a full-time job, and now I work for Dr. Cecily Costello, and I love every minute of it. So yeah, trapping bears, although not trapping as many bears, I'm more in the office like Haraldson said, but yeah. So not a 40-year career, but almost 20 years with bears.
Thanks, Lori. And so everyone in this that does this work has many duties, extra duties assigned. So officially, you're working on the trend monitoring and on the research side, but you have done quite a bit of work. Again, you may have met Danielle Euler from Fish, Wildlife, and Parks at the entrance with the materials. She's one of our information education outreach chairs, and you work with Danielle and the other chairs around the region. Yeah. Where's the energy for you in that work?
Well, so Greg Lazinski, did I say his last name right? I think I did. Yeah, Greg Lazinski, who worked for Idaho Fish and Game, was the IEO chair for many years. I don't even know how long. But he then retired, and there was this position open, and Matt Hogan was chair at the time, and we needed to fill that Information Education and Outreach chair. And to me, I had been going to our subcommittee meetings and the IGBC committee meetings, and just really was impressed with the group of people that was there. And I really wanted to bring my experience working for multiple agencies and in multiple capacities as a tech or as a conflict specialist and a researcher into that information and education and outreach role. And so my boss said, sure, I think it'd be great for you. And I like to add extra work sometimes to my workload, and so that's what I did.
So a number of us speakers talked about the individuals and communities, and learning from the experts like yourself about bear awareness. Do you want to describe to us the Bear Smart Communities program, and do you want to roll our clip? How do you want to do that?
Sure. Well, one thing I wanted to say was I think one of the great things that I saw throughout working in the park and then working for the state was, like everyone has said up here, was partnerships. Working with the communities, working with the NGOs, and then working with other agencies. And so working with my chairs like Danielle and Dylan and those, they have so many great ideas. And so one of our first goals was to just bring consistency to all of the ecosystems, because everyone was kind of doing their own thing. But as we see this expansion and this growth, we've learned that we're all doing the same thing, but how can we all work together? And so Kim Johnston, who works for People and Carnivores, she brought this idea that they had been doing in British Columbia, Canada to me, and she said, hey, they've been doing this Bear Smart program for a really long time, and they've been really successful. But it's strictly a Canadian well, it's not strictly a Canadian program, but it's very Canadian based. And she said, I think IGBC would be the perfect place for it to be housed. And so we took it to the executive committee and said, hey, we have this idea that we would like to rewrite the manual and give communities an idea of how they can make their communities bear smart. And so we did. The executive committee thought that was a great idea, and so we moved forward and we brought in a committee of bear specialists, our IEO folks, and some nonprofits, Kim Johnston and Andrea Morehouse from up in Canada, and we rewrote the Bear Smart Manual to make it more US-based and kind of we inserted some other ideas. And the executive committee liked it, and they adopted it, and they put it on their website. And so I think it really is a tool. I loved Mary's question, and I was like, one thing that we're really proud of is we wrote this manual, we wrote the framework, and it's to have communities take their matters of being bear smart into their own hands and make it a community project. So, yeah. So the town of Gardner has really started doing it, and so the FWP did this clip the other day, and we just thought there was a great section talking about bear smart communities in Grizzly Bear.
On the border of Yellowstone National Park, and with a population of just under 900, the community of Gardner takes a grassroots approach to the reality of living among grizzly bears in a Yellowstone ecosystem.
This is Evan Stout. He's with Bear Aware Gardner.
Bear Awareness Gardner is a small nonprofit here in town under the Bear Creek Council umbrella, and our focus is to try to essentially bear-proof Gardner and get the residents and the business owners the supplies or the goods that they need to keep their property bear safe, and then also do some outreach and education with the public, and kind of most importantly with the residents, to make sure we all know how and when and where we need to be taking those precautions. Part of Bear Awareness Gardner is we want to make everybody aware. We want to get the word out that bears have been using this basin for hundreds of years, thousands of years, and they're still using it. And
that's where that infrastructure really comes into place, because where we as an agency start getting really concerned about bears of either species is when there's any level of habituation or food conditioning. And when bears that are used to coming in and around people start to actually get food rewards of a non-natural food source, those are the two kind of things that really come together when we start thinking about management actions, because a habituated and food conditioned grizzly bear can be a very dangerous thing. They're dangerous and wild animals in and of themselves. They're very unpredictable. But at the end of the day, if they start getting in the garbage and they start getting used to being around people, those are bears that we potentially are going to have issues with when it comes to human safety. And so we work very closely with NGOs, the Forest Service, the BLM, National Park Service, and the Fish and Wildlife Service. It's all one big group that works together on a day-to-day basis to handle and manage grizzly bears amongst a growing human population and a growing bear population.
Although the
And so, I mean, Jeremiah said it really well, like, it's a partnership. And so one of the different steps to the Bear Smart community that we did was to build your committee of people who can commit or work in that community to do different jobs. And we want the agencies to be involved, and watershed groups, and people that have time, city officials, the garbage haulers, things like that. You assess your community. You look at your community, where are some of the spots where, we've been having problems or potential problems. What is our garbage, time pickups, what kind of cans do we use, things like that. After your assessment, you really then move forward to building a plan. The plan is, a timeline and funding, and what are we gonna tackle first, and then move forward and try to make your community more bear smart.
Thanks very much, Lori.
Yeah.
So that is our program for the evening. A number of the next step questions are on our agenda for our winter business meeting, which is tomorrow and Thursday here in Bozeman, or you can, there's a virtual attendance option as well. I'll just end by saying that the recovery of grizzly bears in the lower 48 states is a conservation success story, and it underscores what can be achieved through effective collaboration. I want to thank everyone for coming this evening, and please be safe. Take care.